Today we're going to take apart this Cannondale BB30 bottom bracket and set the bearings with some Loctite to eliminate a creak that's developed with some riding in wet conditions. BB30 bottom brackets are notorious for this. So the first thing to do is to use a 10mm Allen wrench to remove the bolt that holds in the crank. And then we'll be able to use a crank press to get the crank arm off. There, you can actually cheat with a Park crank extractor. Just make sure you get it really well lubricated with grease before you try this. So the first thing you do is simply take the crank extractor and screw it into the crank arm until it's snug up against the spindle. And then you don't want to use the arm on the actual crank extractor, but instead use something like a crescent adjustable wrench on the extractor itself and very slowly and carefully turn the extractor inside the crank arm. You don't want to really crank on this because you don't have a lot of surface to work with, so just very slowly and carefully turn that, and you'll feel the crank arm loosen up, and after a turn or two you'll be able to pull it off of the spindle like that. Then once the crank arm is off, I'm going to use this rubber mallet to gently tap the crank arm out of the bottom bracket, the spindle and the crank arm out of the bottom bracket. As I go, I will take apart the pieces of the bottom bracket that come out and keep them carefully in order so that we can reassemble them. And as we go, that crank arm should be able to be slipped out the opposite side. If not, once in a while you have to use a punch or a deep set socket to help you tap it out. So now that we have all the components out of the bottom bracket and out of the way, we're going to use this Park number 670.2 bottom bracket BB30 tool to remove the bearings from the bottom bracket. Now in this case I've taken the bike out of the bike stand so that we don't jar everything while we're tapping the bearing out. So I'm not using a rubber mallet, I'm using a regular metal hammer so that I get a nice even clean strike on the tool as I remove the bearing. And you'll also notice that I've taken the bike out of the stand so I don't really give everything else a shake as I do this. I want the tires against the ground to help me with the force here. So here we go. You'll want to recenter the tool on the bearing once in a while to make sure you're getting a nice even strike on it. And over the course of a few strikes, you should be able to tap it out. One thing you'll notice about this bottom bracket is that it uses two C-clips to hold the bearing in on either side. In this case, the factory delivered C-clips are the style you see here. Sometimes that part with the hole in it sticks out enough to interfere with the bearing and shouldn't be used. But given that these are factory delivered, I'm going to stick with them. They're fairly low profile. For the sake of time, we've already inserted the bearing on the other side of this bottom bracket, but I'll show you how to insert the drive side bearing. You'll see here we have the bearing and all contact sides of it nice and clean, to where the Loctite will have a nice clean surface to adhere to. Ditto the inside of the bottom bracket shell itself. Now I'm using a modified Nash bar bearing press here. You don't necessarily have to have one that's quite so big or complex. You can buy or even make much simpler bearing presses out there, but this is the one that I have access to, so it's the one we're going to use. So before we put any adhesive whatsoever on the bearing, we're going to go ahead and get it partially set. So I'm just running the bearing, running the press up to partially set the bearing here as I talk. Okay, I'll pause there. For this application, we're going to use Loctite 641 retaining compound. It's a medium strength Loctite that is specifically engineered for bearing fit and allows disassembly of the bottom bracket at a later date if you need it. So I'm going to take the retaining compound and run a very small bead around the outside of this bearing now that I have it partially set. It doesn't take much at all. And I like to put it on the outside of the bearing like this so that as the bearing is inserted into the bottom bracket shell, any excess is actually moved outside the bike frame and not pushed into the bottom bracket shell itself. That's why I do this on the outside of the bearing as it's being inserted, rather than putting it on the bottom bracket shell prior to insertion of the bearing. We'll give that just a few seconds to osmose down into the nooks and crannies of that bottom bracket shell, and then we'll go ahead and continue our press. So I'm just slowly turning the press, which is pushing that bearing in there nice and evenly. And once we hit some resistance, we will know that it's up against that retaining clip, and there it is. So prior to putting in the spindle again, I'm just going to put a thin layer of Park Polylube on this on either side, just to make sure that there's no noise and no excess friction between the insides of the bearings and the spindle itself. Again, it doesn't take much. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a visible layer, but it helps get the spindle back in smoothly. So it should be able to be wiggled in through the bearings. If you have to use a lot of banging or force, you may have some misalignment. Now it's just a matter of putting the drive side crank arm back on with the chain ring. In this case, with these Cannondale hologram single speed systems, there's not any reason to need to deal with a front derailleur, which makes this job easier. And you can see that I've put some fresh grease inside the crank arm itself, and I've reassembled the bottom bracket in the order that things came off. So I just slip the drive side crank arm back on and insert the bolt, and with the 10mm Allen wrench that we used earlier, I will torque this and then put the chain back on, and it's done. Now you'll want to give this about 24 hours to set, but this should fix any creaking issues you have with your BB30 bottom bracket. The one thing that I should mention is that with a composite frame like carbon, in addition to the Loctite we used, you may want to add an accelerant to set the Loctite after insertion of the bearings, because if you don't have a metal on metal interface, it doesn't always set properly. So thanks for watching. I'll look forward to your comments below.